How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? Okay, let's start with a birthday. With the upcoming celebrations for what would have been John Lennon's 80th birthday, I have to admit that looking back to the 60s is rather alarming. Good grief, is it such a long way away? The Beatles first hit the headlines, I suppose, round about 1962. That's nearly 60 years ago. I was at school then, and if I'd looked back 60 years from then, it would have taken me back to 1922. That was so far back in the past, it was ancient history. I actually met Lennon once. I can't remember the year, but I was part of a group that was worried about the way big business was taking over the world. These days, I'm even secretly intrigued by the way we may have companies like Apple and Amazon that have valuations on a par with the top 20 economies on the planet. I seriously wonder where to next. Back then, I was worrying about whether we were going to be engulfed in a system that was going to be controlled by big business. And one day, John Lennon turned up to one of our meetings. It was initially exciting, of course, until he pretty well took over the meeting and poured cold water on our ideas. Although I could have sworn it was earlier, I think it must have been in the early 70s, and there's one of the problems I've got at the moment. However I look back on my past, I can't get the time frames to slot into the right order. It's always been said that if you remember the 60s, you obviously weren't there. But that, of course, is rubbish. I remember the 60s quite well, and it was a lot of fun. One thing Lennon said to me was that the world is full of interesting people. He shrugged his shoulders and grinned at me. Don't I remember you? I've seen you somewhere before. Well, I guess it was somewhere around 1970, maybe a bit earlier, but at the time I'd just moved from the outskirts of London to the wilds of Somerset, and by chance met a guy called Gordon Perkins, who at the time ran an antique shop in Paul Street in Frome. I'd studied law at Oxford, well, amongst other things, and was quite good at arguing in court. And Gordon was annoyed that he was being hounded by the police because he didn't produce his driving licence within the statutory 5 days. At least I think that was the problem. His argument was that he couldn't produce the document because he'd lost it and had asked DVLA to send him another one. Was that a crime? Well, apparently the answer was yes, and he ultimately got fined £5. If you're relatively young, you must be wondering what the heck this has to do with John Lennon. However, let's press on. All will become clear. Gordon decided to do things in style. A friend of his owned a steam engine, and there's a big clue for you all. He did a deal with this guy to borrow it for a morning. In short, we all went to court on a steam engine. We drove to the Black Horse pub on the Frome Road in Trowbridge, and there, in the pub yard, was this amazing steam engine, gently hissing and puffing. Gordon was dressed up in his fancy clothes and top hat. David Goddard walked in front, waving an enormous red flag, and we formed a procession behind. The cavalcade went down the road, turned into the central ring road, and round we went. Twice. Shops were empty, as all the customers were out on the pavements, so the people were all watching this absurd procession. And normal traffic, of course, was in gridlock. While the court officials were calling a certain Mr. Perkins, we were entertaining the good folk of Trowbridge. Twice round the ring road, and then we fetched up outside another pub. I forget its name, but I think it was roughly opposite the courthouse, and there Gordon was interviewed for a TV channel. Eventually we made it to a packed courthouse, and Gordon was downstairs. I, unfortunately, had been shunted up into the gallery, and I tried to conduct his case from up there. It was a ridiculous charade, complete farce. Eventually even the magistrates couldn't handle it any more, and insisted I come down and sit next to Gordon. I had to have a police escort just to get me through the throng. At the end of proceedings, of course, we all went home and watched ourselves on TV. The following day, we were on the front page of every daily newspaper in the land. Still puzzled about the Lennon connection? Well, I reminded John where he'd probably seen me, and he laughed and said, that's what I always say, the world's full of fascinating people. However, he was quoted by the press as saying something slightly different. This was a little later. It went like this. The world is full of normal people. There was a guy who went to court on a steamroller. He was perfectly normal. However, that is not the case. No, John, Gordon was not normal. Gordon was a one-off. And I still miss him. Okay, so much for the dim and distant past. Fast forward a decade or so, and some idiot decided to shoot poor John, and he died on the way to hospital. At the time, I was a struggling musician living now in West London and fronting a band called the Mockers. We formed up at the recording studios of John Hamilton, who, all those years later, still plays keyboard and guitars on my songs. I used to turn up at his place with my mate Chris Stearns, who was an ace guitarist. And one day we were recording some material at the studio in Eastcote when John suddenly got up and went to phone a mate of his called Andy, who was a rather fine pianist. In fact, John's mother used to give him piano lessons. Hope you're taking notes here. Yeah, short quiz at the end. Andy duly turned up and played keyboards on several of our sessions. A few weeks later, Chris said, "We can't keep mucking about like this. We need a proper drummer." He went downstairs and phoned Julian. And, lo and behold, we had a band. We took the name from a Beatles interview where someone asked Paul if the Beatles were mods or rockers. To be diplomatic, Paul replied they were neither. They were mockers. That rang the right sort of bell for us. So we became the Mockers. Next time I went to John's studio, we sat and had a coffee while he set up the gear. Oh, by the way, I rang up Andy and told him you would be in here today. He opened a packet of Chocky Bix and said, "Oh, yes, and Chris might be coming round as well to put down some Les Paul." And that is how the Mockers have operated ever since. We accidentally became a band, and everything has been accidental ever since. We just turned up to make music and have a lot of fun. But on the day Lennon died, Julian and I were working for the GLC. We had part-time jobs in order to survive. Gigging when you don't have a record in the charts is not very lucrative. By and large, Julian and I survived by raiding his mother's fridge for food, which we topped up with Mars bars for the sugar hit, and onions, which helped to give the impression we'd just eaten. Julian borrowed the odd fiver from Angela, and I cashed the child allowance. One way or another, I guess we got by. And so it was, on a day when we were working for the GLC, that's the Greater London Council, the news of Lennon's death hit us, I suppose, round about lunchtime. I was living in West Ealing at the time with Francis, and as I walked up Avenue Road, I felt a song coming on. By the time I'd reached the front door, I'd actually finished it. When I got in, I picked up the phone and rang our management company and sang them a verse. They rushed us into a recording studio, and we put down the song, which was called I'm Sorry, John. The recording studio actually left something to be desired. We don't have a single set of cans that worked properly. Yeah, but we're just still building the place, said the engineer. Julian was wearing one of those cans at the time. I know, he said, I can hear them still working in the cans. If the opening section of the song comes across slightly shaky, it's because the only way we could play was as a group, with someone, which was me, beating time because we couldn't hear each other playing. Of course, when we played the track to the music world, everybody loved it. But, there's always a but, isn't there? Then came the news there was going to be a blackout on tribute songs. It's been in the cupboard ever since, until now. Well, if you like that sort of thing, give it a listen, and maybe give it a like. I'll put a link to a complete recording of the track. I think that goes down below, but I've got to check out how to do these things. And hopefully I'll try and do a few more videos as time goes on. And, tune in and see me again. And as I say, do give us a like. Makes us feel wanted.